Good morning. Welcome to this morning's discussion of Psyfeld. We will focus on the episode, The Bookstore. So who would like to start? Anything strike your eye or catch your eye in the assigned episode?
I thought it was interesting. Jerry found out his whole family was doing it, and they kind of played it off as just, they kind of brushed it off in general, made excuses about it.
More specific, what actually is revealed in terms of Jerry and his entire family?
Oh, they're all stealing impulsively for things they don't need, and like kleptomania.
So Leah, let's talk about that. So let's pick one. We'll just go with Jerry for now. And somehow he is referred to you for psychiatric evaluation, the information of which, after 60 or 90 minutes of evaluation, sorry about that, result in your understanding what you've come to understand from watching the episode. So that's the information that we have. Initial thoughts that come to mind in terms of a differential diagnosis.
Kleptomania for that.
Okay, so any more?
I mean, in the case of the elderly uncle who he observed doing that and then was also hearing noises and everything like that, I would be concerned about a major neurocognitive disorder like a dementia, or I'd also be concerned about actually those symptoms on their own without the age context might also make me think of a TBI, the tinnitus in combination with behavioral changes. So I'd ask about a history of trauma or falls.
So a delirium, rule out chronic encephalopathy. Okay.
I would be thinking maybe not an actual psychiatric diagnosis, but malingering, because when he says the thing about the phone ringing, it was almost as if he was trying to demonstrate to Jerry, here's an example of me pretending to be old and senile so that I can get things that I want. So yeah, I would think malingering.
Okay. Any others? So now we're concentrating on two characters, Jerry and Uncle Leo. Both are exhibiting similar behaviors, and let's say both present to you, albeit not in the same office visit, with that chief complaint. Any others to consider?
I was thinking about it being more something like a compulsion or something like that. Like they need the feeling that they need to steal something and having to do so.
Okay. Got it. Oh, you have a vote in the background. Was that you, Karen?
I was thinking also maybe narcissism. And I think George displays this, but I think it could be true of Jerry's parents as well and the uncle, of this entitlement, the parents say something oh, it's not stealing if you need it, like batteries, that's not stealing. So it's this level of entitlement that I am owed these things, and therefore there's nothing wrong with my behavior.
Good. All right. So let's focus on Jerry first, and let's see if we can begin to formulate a differential diagnosis as to what may explain his, for lack of a better description, stealing behavior. For Jerry, let's start out with the idea of kleptomania. And let's fold in a differential delirium, as well as, for now, we'll just say cluster B traits, this feeling of entitlement, narcissistic versus antisocial personality disorder, okay? First and foremost, delirium. If you're going to prioritize, we always prioritize organic etiologies first. So the direct and physiologic effect of a substance and or medical condition. Any evidence of that supporting delirium in Jerry, or more specifically, explaining Jerry's behavior? Anyone?
I don't think so.
I agree. Probably not here, but it's got to be that necessary first step. In clinical practice, there may be some routine labs that we get, but beyond that, probably nothing further to do. Real quick, delirium for shelf purposes adheres to the 3 C's of the DSM. So there are cognitive deficits. There are at least 2, and 1 must be in concentration / attention. These cognitive deficits have a specific course. So course is your second C, acute in onset and fluctuating, which helps differentiate from the neurocognitive disorders. We're going to discuss them in just a second when we begin to talk about what ails Uncle Leo. The final C is the cause. The cause, unlike any other in the entire DSM, is due to an underlying medical condition or a substance. The direct opposite must hold true for any other mental disorder diagnosed in your patient. Okay, so adhering to those 3 C's, focusing on those cognitive deficits. I don't see them here. I don't see cognitive deficits in general. I don't see delirium in particular underlying or explaining Jerry's behavior in the bookstore. So now kleptomania versus cluster B traits. What might guide us here in terms of questions we need answered to help differentiate this illness called kleptomania versus personality disorders in cluster B, including narcissistic and antisocial?
I think for kleptomania, one thing to consider is it spontaneous? And also, is it something that they need or that they don't need to, like some people are stealing out of a need for something and, stealing batteries for no reason, or a book for no reason.
So clarify, in which condition would the person have no value for the stolen object versus valuing?
Kleptomania would have no value.
Exactly right. And very often after the event, the items are discarded. On the other hand, if they were stolen for a reason, that's much more consistent with another illness, examples of which include the cluster B personality disorders. Right. Now, again, be careful here because impulsivity is a diagnostic criterion of the antisocial personality disorder. And kleptomania is an impulse control disorder. So impulsivity may not clarify one versus the other, but certainly value does, okay, among others. But that's a great place to start. Okay. In Jerry's case, what's our focus? Do we think these are of value to him, or do you think he is just stealing for the sake of filling an impulse that sometimes individuals will explain as coming out of the blue?
I think it's confusing because it's hard to tell because, based on the episode, because it seems like they talk about it like it's no big deal, but they do it on the regular, but it seems like they do it often. And it's kind of hard to tell if it's impulsive or not, the way they talked about on the phone.
Well, let's pick an instance. Name me one thing Jerry steals. Anyone?
I was confused by this because I don't remember Jerry stealing anything. It was more that he seemed focused on other people stealing things. Like his uncle was stealing books, his parents were stealing batteries, George was stealing a book, but I don't remember Jerry stealing anything.
So let's swing to Jerry's parents then. Do they need the batteries, or do they just steal that particular object to fulfill a need, an impulse?
It doesn't sound like much of an impulse. Like, for instance, the mom says that the dad normally is the one who does it. And it seems specifically with certain items that they think that they deserve, in a way. And like she says that when the dad can't do it, then she goes and does it instead of him. So it doesn't really seem like an impulse.
And to the extent, and this is their self-report, that they deserve it, does anyone here think that upon stealing, they readily discard, for example, the batteries? If you had a guess, probably not, right? So we're probably not dealing with kleptomania here when we look at Mr. Seinfeld. We're probably dealing with a cluster B trait. We would then at this point look or delve into whether or not there's narcissism versus antisocial personality traits. A little bit beyond the scope of our talk today. We've discussed that previously, but this would be the next step, right? Uncle Leo, right? So we go to the brother-in-law, Uncle Leo. Very similar differential. Anything in addition, in his particular case, that would broaden our differential?
Like a history of more of other actions like throughout his life that might be consistent to show like a personality issue rather than impulsivity around one particular structure.
Yeah, they said he had a crime of passion and he spent time in jail.
Yeah, I think Uncle Leo sheds a little bit of light on that next step that we would have taken with Mr. Seinfeld, right? I mean, we're at a point in Mr. Seinfeld or in describing and explaining Mr. Seinfeld's behavior where we're within the cluster B of personality disorders. And Uncle Leo helps us take that next step with that crime of passion. This looks like it actually might be antisocial personality disorder in Uncle Leo, right? His history clarifies this even further, albeit for a different character. I do want to talk and discuss briefly the illness of major neurocognitive disorder, otherwise or previously known as delirium. What differentiates this condition from mild neurocognitive disorder? I think that's first and foremost, and again, something that may in fact appear on your shelf exam.
Their activities of daily living are intact.
Yeah, generally speaking, individuals with mild neurocognitive disorder do not suffer from clinically significant distress or impairment. And it's only one of two conditions in the entire DSM in which that is true, the other being hypomania. That very finding helps differentiate hypomania from mania. Every other condition in the DSM requires clinical significance. Hypomania itself, the finding of bipolar 2 encyclothymia, and mild neurocognitive disorder are the two exceptions to the rule. Okay. So for major neurocognitive disorder, AKA dementia, in Uncle Leo, I want to differentiate this for this particular character in the particular scenes that we observed from malingering and factitious disorder. So why might a clinician consider malingering to be the most diagnosis in Uncle Leo and not major neurocognitive disorder?
He seems to be fully aware of his actions and able to explain why he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah, I agree.
He even specifically explains that he has a good excuse for it, that he can just say, oh, but I'm old, I got confused. And he says it in a mocking tone when he's explaining it to Jerry.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, so malingering would be very high on this list. And I think to the extent that he's able to explain it and report to us what motivates his behavior, again, motivation in psychiatry and psychology is referred to as gain. Uncle Leo's gain is such that it's much more consistent with malingering than factitious disorder. Individuals who make a conscious effort to deceive law enforcement, security, physicians for reasons that they're unaware of, for reasons that are subconscious, are demonstrating behavior that is much more consistent with factitious, right? But Uncle Leo has external gain from this. Whatever he's stealing, he's keeping. There's value, and that's much more consistent with malingering. than it is factitious. Any other observations about Uncle Leo in this episode, discussing the bookstore? Any other characters catch your eye that you'd like to discuss this morning?
I would say George. And his like stealing of the book, but there's like a really great moment at the end of the episode when Jerry is talking to him and George is telling him how he is going to steal a book so that he could get even. And Jerry kind of points out to him, okay, so you've defiled one of their books and now you're going to steal another book so you can return it for money. And somehow you think that is even. So it's interesting, his perception of that balance.
Yeah, in that way, Jerry is acting like George's external superego, right? It's that part of us that is represents the imposed societal norm. In this case, through the voice of his best friend, social conscience, if you will. By the way, if that is the case, George's intent, George's impulse would be what component of the Freudian personality or the Freudian subconscious, if Jerry is the superego? All right. How about any of my undergrads? This is right up your coursework. The id. Okay, so and we're talking about impulsivity, albeit in a slightly different context in this episode. But the Freudian id, that aspect, that component of our subconscious, houses George's, Jerry's, our primal impulses. And the only reason why they're not demonstrated on a daily basis, the only reason why any of us are right now not currently at acute psychiatric services being evaluated is because of that second component called the superego, societal's prohibitions. This results in what Freud called anxiety, right? The friction between what we want to do and what we are allowed to do. And that anxiety is alleviated by the third and final component of the subconscious, that is the ego. And the way the ego does this is through these subconscious or unconscious processes called the ego defense processes, right? They aim to alleviate the anxiety caused by the friction between one's id and superego. That is what, in this case, George and Jerry are discussing. Any other observations in George or Jerry? Any other scenes in this movie that caught your attention? It's a movie, sorry, episode that caught your attention. I'm already thinking of later on this morning. What's going on with Kramer?
There's a character with opioid withdrawal.
Okay. You're using big words back to back. What is opioid withdrawal? Anyone? I think we're focusing on Zach.
I mean, in this case, it seemed like he was just throwing up a lot, like suffering physically from the withdrawal period. And other than that, it was mostly off screen, but I'd also expect like a bunch of other sympathetic symptoms and more GI upset.
Yep. On a shelf exam, what will a vignette that single best answer is opioid withdrawal look like?
Like someone with dilated pupils, piloerection, they're feverish, they're tachycardic, they've had nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, like they look sick, and they feel very sick as well. And like they're miserable. And they have a
Very.
history of
It'll look clinically indistinguishable from the flu. So any flu-like syndrome on a psychiatry shelf will be opioid withdrawal until proven otherwise, right? So identify it as the flu. You may, that is on the shelf exam, you may or may not be provided the history of opioid use disorder or in the HPI, opioid intoxication. All right, so let's start off first with the initial state, which would be the intoxication state, even the overdose state. Individuals who are either intoxicated or have overdosed on opioids will have pinpoint pupils. Now, infrequently, they may actually present with dilated pupils. And I couldn't give you a percentage of the time. Let's throw a ballpark out there. About 10% of the time, their pupils will be dilated. On a shelf exam, it's 50-50. The odds really stink for the M3s because it's an artificial vignette and the question writer can create one of two scenarios that is 50-50. So you must know the medication / drug that is likely to cause the dilated pupil rather than the pinpoint pupil. And we're talking about opioid intoxication / overdose. Which medication does this? Meperidine. Meperidine has an anticholinergic side effect that overwhelms the mu opioid receptor effect. So in cases of intoxication and overdose, individuals are likely to present with dilated instead of pinpoint pupils. So be very careful on shelf exams when you see slurred speech, when you see one's level of consciousness being compromised, perhaps coma, and dilated pupils do not automatically rule out opioid or heroin overdose. Opioid or meperidine overdose. The second state that might follow once your patient survives by giving them naltrexone or naloxone is the withdrawal state. And again, this would be clinically indistinguishable from the flu. So the acronym here is TGI Fridays. On exams, you will never have to know the threshold number of symptoms required for the diagnosis. So even though the T in the acronym TGI Fridays represents 3 of the following, it's there for acronym purposes. On exams, if you have 2 of the following, it might still be the single best answer. Right? So just keep that in mind. The rest of the acronym falls fairly straightforward. GI stands for GI, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Fridays, fever, rhinorrhea or lacrimation, insomnia, dysphoria, arthralgia, yawning, and sympathetic symptoms. So diaphoresis, tremor, goose flesh, high blood pressure, elevated pulse. TGI Fridays. All right, so I'm not going to get, we only have about 5 minutes left. I'm not going to get into the treatment and what would help Zach in his current state. We'll talk about that in morning rounds. Any other observations in the bookstore?
I just think that something worth noting is that when Kramer and Jerry both see Uncle Leo like look at the books on the shelf and then put it into his coat, Kramer says to Jerry, like in a joking manner, well, that ought to keep you busy for a couple days. So that kind of like brings up Jerry's compulsions or obsessions.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we see this as a recurrent theme across all 9 seasons of this sitcom, which again is somewhat interesting because the very behavior that Shelby had identified was not seen in Jerry himself runs a continuum with the observation that you just made in Jerry, and that is kleptomania has been associated with obsessive compulsive disorders. Now, unlike other disorders previously linked to kleptomania, kleptomania itself has remained in a separate chapter. But it's a chapter that is often described in context with or in association with the obsessive compulsive and related disorders. And anytime we see this behavior, the differential, a broadened differential, will definitely include illnesses from both chapters. That is the obsessive compulsive and related disorders, including OCD, as well as the impulse control disorders chapter, which, for example, would include kleptomania. What do you think about Kramer's business idea?
It's a very impulsive. Like there's not a lot of underthought about it or awareness of any risks involved.
It's a typical Kramer-Newman idea.
Yeah, so I want to bring both of your comments and again in proper context and merge them. That is, it's not well thought out and it's typical, which means that for Kramer specifically, we're probably talking about a personality trait because it is typical of him. When we see this, we might draw the conclusion, well, that's Kramer being Kramer. And when we're thinking like that, when we draw that type of conclusion, this is much more likely to be consistent with a chronic and persistent illness, such as a personality disorder, and in Kramer, such as a cluster A personality disorder, versus a disorder that might be defined by an episode that is different than baseline functioning. So that's something to consider here. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention, and we only have a couple of minutes left, is that the homeless person that Kramer talks to demonstrates signs of schizophrenia, which really isn't that big of a stretch. We know that there's a downward drift hypothesis. Individuals with this very chronic and debilitating illness often lose their jobs, get separated from their families, and endure abject poverty. And therefore, schizophrenia as a demographic is overrepresented in the homeless population. So not a real stretch here. And you know, Larry David does a decent job here in casting this character in such a way that allows us to talk about some of the behaviors that we observe in this particular character. I don't believe he actually has a name. Beyond the downward drift hypothesis, if we looked and observed his speech, otherwise thought process, you know, he mentions, I'll take the job, potato salad, the government. Well, and together, that's a word salad, otherwise known as evidence of looseness of associations, which is a deficit in speech or thought process. So they're the same thing. On the other hand, to the extent that the words themselves are out of context, they have nothing to do with what Kramer is proposing. So not only is it evidence of looseness of associations, it is also an example of a non sequitur, right? So non sequiturs are contextual errors, whereas looseness of associations are, and the other name for that is a word salad, is an example of a deficit in thought processing, AKA speech, okay? So now, none of the above is specific to schizophrenia. None of the above is specific to psychosis, but typically characterized by the psychotic illnesses nonetheless, and therefore much more likely to present in vignettes about psychosis on a shelf exam. In the minute we have left, any other guesses, any other thoughts, pardon the pun, about further clinical findings that are characteristic, albeit not specific to psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, that you might find on a mental status exam?
I guess you could see the negative effects in a lot of different, multiple disorders.
The other biggie I want you to remember, and this is probably more of a clinical pearl than it would be for the shelf, but poverty of speech would be significant as well. And to your point, if and there was a glitch, so I didn't hear everything you said, but for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, alogia, aka poverty of speech, is consistent with that clinical finding per the DSM criteria, which of course also may manifest during routine mental status exam testing. So poverty of speech, alogia, both a clinical finding as well as a diagnostic criteria, a negative symptom schizophrenia. Good. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank everybody for their time. We're going to be logging back on shortly over Zoom, different link to review and to discuss our table rounds this morning. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for their participation this morning during the bookstore. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.